I thought I'd start by bringing to your attention an article that I just printed out online from The Sun, the British newspaper, about the EU, the European Union. It says, the EU has declared a crackpot war on busty barmaids by trying to ban them from wearing low-cut tops. They've deemed it a health hazard for bar girls to show too much cleavage. They say barmaids run a skin cancer risk if they expose themselves to the sun when they go outside to collect glasses. It's a real thing. So the bureaucrats in Brussels think they should regulate what people wear when they go to work, even. So and that's going to make Europe rich. They're going to be wealthy and free. And you're in Europe, the EU. Okay, well, anyway, the big topic, another big topic, origin and effects of protectionism. And I thought I'd start out with, many of you are familiar with the arguments for free trade and against free trade from school or even from this week in some other lecture. But I thought it'd be worthwhile to talk a little bit about some of these basic, well-known effects that have been known by economists for a long, long time. So that's what I wrote on the blackboard here, is some effects of protectionism, trade restrictions. And of course, we usually refer to tariffs and quotas. Tariff essentially being a sales tax on imported goods, and a quota is a quota. You can only import 10 cars from India, let's say. That would be a quota. But there's also a long list of types of what are called non-tariff trade barriers. For example, in the United States, the tariff rate is very low. The average tariff rate is 3 or 4% on average. And historically, it's been as high as around 60%, 6-0. But since the tariff rate is so low, the preferred type of protectionism that American businesses urge our government to use is predatory pricing lawsuits or dumping lawsuits, where say Toyota will start selling minivans here, and to try to break into the market, they might charge $500 less than what they actually charge in Tokyo. They can be accused of dumping cheap cars, and of course my attitude to that is dump away. If they want to sell me cheap cars or anything, I'll take it. And so that's this sort of thing has taken the place of actual tariffs as the main tool of protectionism. And so point number one, higher prices, that's the purpose of protectionism, so that the protected industries what are they protected from? They're protected from having to drop their prices to compete. That's what they're protected from. And so higher prices, and of course, the more any business is isolated from competitive pressure, the lower will be the quality of its product or service. And so that's the first effect. The consumers are ripped off. Income transfers from consumers to producers is the second effect, and also from potential competitors, if there are other competitors that would have been in there. I mentioned also harms capital goods purchasers. That would be an example of where when President Bush put 50% tariffs on steel, it was one of the first things he did when he came into office. Well, that was harmful to all the steel-using industries, like the American automobile industry. And that's a classic example of the phoniness and the lie that is told by protectionists when they say, buy American, be patriotic, to support trade restrictions. Steel tariffs harmed one group of Americans only to benefit another group of Americans. It's not a patriotic thing. It's theft. I had an email once from Pat Buchanan, the journalist Pat Buchanan, after I wrote an article on trade. And he, of course, is a big protectionist, and he sort of lectured me and told me that these are your neighbors you're talking about. The people who have to compete on international markets, and if you don't support protectionism, you're sort of being antisocial, you're being unneighborly. And I wrote him back and I said, I don't think of these people as friendly neighbors. I think of them more as when I go off to work It's a gang of burglars who breaks into my house and steals my television while I'm off at work. That's how I think of these people. I don't think of them as friendly neighbors who invite me over to a barbecue. That's more what it's like. How friendly is it to make me pay $2,000 more for my next car? What kind of friend is that? And for what reason? So that he can have my $2,000. He might as well break in and steal my $2,000 plasma TV. That's the same exact effect. But so another thing, one of the most famous slogans in all of economics was coined by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, where he said the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. It was the title of a chapter of The Wealth of Nations. And the division of labor and the specialization and the lower production cost that comes from it is limited by how big the market is, how many customers you have. And so international trade widens the market, and it enables economies of scale to occur, and enables producers to lower their costs and become more competitive, and it benefits consumers with lower prices. So when you shrink the market through protectionism, you shrink the opportunities for economies of scale, and it makes your industries less competitive on world markets because they have not experienced economies of scale, and it also stifles the learning curve phenomenon, whereby the more you do of just about anything, the more likely you are to figure out better ways of doing it, lower cost ways of doing it. But if you shrink the market, you have less experience in that regard too. And so it's harmful to industry itself to be protected in that regard. Export dependent businesses, industries, and regions are always disproportionately harmed by protectionism for pretty obvious reasons, I guess, because a tax on imports is also effectively a tax on exports. When you impose a tax on imports for protectionism purposes, then our trading partners, people who sell things to us here in the U.S. from abroad, thereby get fewer dollars with which they can buy American products. And so that reduces the demand for exports from the U.S. So export-dependent regions, industries, businesses are always harmed by protectionism for the benefit of those few businesses that are protected or benefited by tariffs or quotas, for that matter. Okay. And this has always been true in the U.S. It has always been farmers who have been disproportionately harmed by protectionism, because they've always exported a lot of wheat and corn and soybeans and products all over the world. So whenever we reduce world trade by putting tariffs on imported farm goods, or any kind of goods, it inevitably hurts farmers disproportionately. And historically, that's why the farm movement in the 19th century were behind the income tax. They were supporting the income tax. They thought it would take pressure off the tariff rate, because the tariff rate was 40 to 50% in the late 19th century, and American farmers were getting killed by that because their export markets were drying up.
But you wouldn't say that's why we got farm subsidies, so we get hit again.
No, that's another story. Protectionism empowers the state because it creates a whole bureaucracy to organize all of this, and in the case of tariffs, it gives the state more money, which in my view is always a bad idea. It's always a bad thing, whether it's from a lottery or from a tariff or anything else. If you were to go back in the stacks here and pick up any international trade textbook that might be back there, or any Principles of Economics book, Samuelson's Principles is right behind the wall there. There will be a section on tariffs versus quotas, and it will say, if you're going to have protectionism, tariffs are preferred to quotas. Why? Because at least with tariffs, the government raises more money. Even if they have the exact same effect in terms of restricting trade and higher prices, a tariff is always preferred to quotas because it enlarges the state even further. It gives it more money. But that of course, is always pawned off as some sort of scientific and objective analysis in the textbooks. But it's not. It's a normative value judgment that is snuck in there saying we think government should be bigger than it already is. But in every single I've never seen a textbook that didn't say that covered this issue on trade. And so I see that as a bad thing. poor countries are harmed. A low-income farmer from some South American or African country that would like to sell in the United States is unequivocally harmed if he cannot sell in the United States. He has a smaller market. And so when we do that, we restrict the ability of people like this to sell us goods, whether it's farm goods or anything else, and that makes them poorer. And then quite often what we will do is we will send foreign aid to these countries after we have further impoverished them with our protectionism. That was the explicit policy of the Reagan administration, for example. They explicitly put very high tariffs on certain types of goods coming from some of the poorest countries in the world, and then right along with it, they increased the amount of foreign aid that they sent to those countries, and foreign aid harms these countries even more. For example, they can't if it appears that they can't feed themselves well enough, we send them 1 million tons of grain. The dumping of grain in their country drops the price of grain down close to zero, so that the farmers there cannot make a living farming. They move into the cities to look for work, which exacerbates the poverty and unemployment problem in the cities, and it becomes a big mess. The big beneficiaries, of course, are American farmers, because the U.S. government pays them for all their farm goods, which is then sent to the less developed countries. Or the tractors. If John Deere wants to send tractors to one of these countries, the tractor manufacturer is a big beneficiary of foreign aid. And historically, foreign aid has always been government-to-government aid. And so foreign aid always enlarges the governments of the recipient countries, first and foremost, which is yet another bad thing, in addition to driving their farmers out of work. So foreign aid is related to protectionism, and has been for a long time. Protectionism historically has encouraged a war and conflict, not in every single instance, but there are many instances throughout history. Friedrich Bastiat, the great French economist and journalist, popularized the phrase, if goods can't cross borders, armies will, observing that if people can't cooperate with one another and prosper that way, that's the free market. After all, the free market is cooperation and plan coordination among different people all over the world. It's the International Division of Labor. If they can't do that, if they can't benefit that way, one alternative way of improving your lot is conquest, taking from other people. And so, this happened very clearly at the outset of World War II, where the United States was hyper-protectionist. We passed a tariff. The average tariff rate was 59% in 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. It's usually called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff after two congressmen, but Herbert Hoover, as president, signed it, so I don't know why his name shouldn't be attached to it. They call it the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. And of course, it was particularly harmful to Japan and strengthened the political hand of the fascists in Japan, and encouraged them to retaliate in World War II. And so, and also, if you read Bastiat, which I encourage everybody to go and read Bastiat if you've never read Bastiat on trade, he coined the phrase legal plunder. Protectionism is a form of legal plunder. It's an attack on private property. It simply says the government has a right to steal one person's property, to give it to their friends, another political friends, and keep some of the loot for itself. That's what a tariff is. And so back in Bastiat's day, which was the late 1840s, this idea wasn't quite as pervasive. That is the idea that it was legitimate for the state to steal property only to give it to somebody else. And so in Bastiat, of course, he was battling the socialists of his time, and he made the most important point of all, I think, because it really is an attack on private property. It really is legalized theft, a form of legalized theft. And once you go down that road, where's the end of it? If the state can steal your property through protectionism, well, they can steal it through taxation, through regulation, through any device, because it's legitimate now. And he equated it to communism. He called protectionism and communism pretty much philosophically the same thing. And so those are some of the main effects of protectionism. There are other things that people have written about forever. You can get into a lot of detail, but I think this is some of the main reasons for this. I guess I could add also reduced innovation. When businesses are isolated from competition, they're less likely to spend money on research and development and innovation because they don't have to. They don't have much competition. The American automobile industry was like that after World War II, when they had very little effective competition, and they produced a lot of really terrible cars. And I remember owning a Plymouth Volare once. It was a horrible mess of a machine, and that's, why should they produce good cars? And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal I used to hand out to my classes. It had a big long title on it. It said, "If you like your new American car, thank your neighbor with the 15-year-old Honda." That was the title of the car. And the point of the article was the American car makers have improved a lot in the quality of their cars. Why? Honda and Toyota. And they had to. Honda and Toyota were so successful, the American car companies faced the choice of either improve and compete with Honda and Toyota, or disappear, go bankrupt. And so they did. They persevered, and they produce much better cars now. And the opposite is true. If they were protected from Honda and Toyota, why would they have done that? They would have just keep producing Plymouth Volares for us, or the kind of cars you used to see in Eastern Europe. The what?
Trabant.
Yeah, the Trabants. Yeah. My friend Don Boudreau told me he was right after the fall of communism. He was in Eastern Europe, and he was in Germany. He said he was on the Autobahn, and he was driving very fast, and there was a flickering light way off in the distance, and he couldn't figure out what the heck it was. It didn't look like a tail light, or it was a white flickering light, and it was one of these cars with a candle in the back. The candle was the backup light, the rear light. And so, but that's, it's kind of, Americans made cars like that too in the 50s and 60s. And so that's one other extra thing I would add on there. And as far as trade in general goes, I want to quote Murray Rothbard once on the importance of trade to civilization, because this is a particularly nice, eloquent statement about trade and the market economy. He wrote this. He said, "The market economy is one vast lattice work throughout the world in which each individual, each region, each country produces what he or it is best at, most relatively efficient in, and exchanges that product for the goods and services of others. Without the division of labor and the trade based upon that division, the entire world would starve." Think what your life would be like if you in a world of autarky, where you had to produce your own food. How many of you produce all your own food, by the way? Nobody? You produce all your own food?
Yeah,
okay. Partially? All your food? You purchased a dinner last night. I saw you. You outsourced last night. Just last night. Oh, you have a farm. Okay. How about your clothing? Do you make all your own clothing? No. You produce all your own food? Produce your own beer? Well, that's a food, isn't it? That's, to some people. Yeah. So most of us would starve, of course, if we had to produce our own, and we would, if not, we would freeze to death because we don't produce our own clothing. And of course, all of us outsource. The latest buzzword for trade is outsourcing. And of course, we all outsource for almost everything. I don't produce my own cars, my own clothing, my own food, my own house. I've never built my own house from start to finish. I outsourced. I paid people to do it. So, and he goes on to say, coerced restraints on trade, such as protectionism, cripple, hobble, and destroy trade, the source of life and prosperity, the very source of life and prosperity. And Mises said something similar to this that I think is also an eloquent statement in Human Action. He says, "What distinguishes man from animals is the insight into the advantages that can be derived from cooperation under the division of labor. That's why man is not like an animal. Animals don't usually benefit from this. Man curbs his innate instinct of aggression in order to cooperate with other human beings. The more he wants to improve his material well-being, the more he must expand the system of the division of labor. Concomitantly, he must more and more restrict the sphere in which he resorts to military action. Such is the laissez-faire philosophy of Manchester, meaning that there was a Manchester School of Economics in England in the 19th century. There was a free trade movement. Cobden and Bright were the two businessmen who were best known for that, the Manchester School. And the American founding fathers were free traders for the most part, with the exception of Hamilton. Hamilton was the founding father of statism, I guess, among the founding fathers. But if you look at Thomas Paine's famous book Common Sense, which was sort of the ideological tract of the American Revolution, and it sold 400,000 copies. It was incredible. There was the population of the colonies was very small, and he sold 400,000 copies. Everybody read this. You know, on foreign policy, he said a foreign policy based on commerce would secure for America the peace and friendship of the continent, Europe, and allow her to shake hands with the world and trade in any market. So it was a plea for free trade. He said that free trade would temper the human mind, help people to know and understand each other, and have a civilizing effect on everyone involved in it. And so this trade is a pacific system, peaceful, pacific system, operating to unite mankind by rendering nations as well as individuals useful to each other. War can never be in the interest of a trading nation. End quote. That was Thomas Paine. And so, and George Washington himself, in his farewell address, said this: harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. He said, our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial and neither view, and neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the natural course of things, diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing. So that was his way of saying we should have free trade with the world out there. And so that's why I consider, by the way, other politicians in America, Alexander Hamilton, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, is ideological traitors to the American Revolution in that sense, and that the Revolution was partly a revolt against British mercantilism and especially protectionism, which through the Navigation Acts, something called the Navigation Acts, the King of England was trying to plunder the colonists. And so but then you had this political party, the Federalists, who became the Whigs, who became the Republicans, always wanting protectionism, which was sort of a repudiation of one of the goals of the Revolution, and a repudiation of the words of George Washington and Thomas Paine and Jefferson and people like that. Okay, and so so these are some of the things I thought I'd bring these quotes up because most people don't really recognize this. Classical liberals have always fought for free trade. For hundreds of years, the French physiocrats were among the first free traders in the 18th and 19th centuries. There was a Turgot. I think Turgot's name is up here, isn't it? Is that Turgot? Anybody see Turgot up here somewhere? Where is it? Oh yeah, there it is. A.R.J. Turgot. And Robert Jacques Turgot was a precursor, a French precursor of the Austrian school, and he wrote a lot of things that had become adopted by the Austrians. He was the finance minister of France in 1774, and the very first thing he did was he decreed freedom of import and export of grain as his first official act. So the first thing he did was move France in the direction of free trade in grain anyway. Of course, there was Adam Smith came along and advocated free trade. The Manchester School, I encourage you to read, if you can pick up a book on the Manchester School. It's a really inspiring story of how two businessmen who were not economists, who were not intellectuals, started and led an intellectual movement that ended up creating free trade in England by 1848. They eliminated all trade barriers in England. Bastiat was doing the same thing in France at around the same time. He knew Cobden and Bright. And Bastiat died around 1850. Shortly after, he published his two big books, including one called Economic Harmony. But if you read about Bastiat's life, he had a family farm that he inherited, and he didn't really need to work. And he spent, I think, about 15 years educating himself, nothing but reading, educating himself. He had a close friend that he debated and argued every issue possible with, not just economics, but everything they could get their hands on. And then Bastiat had this big burst of intellectual activity. He wrote hundreds, maybe thousands of pamphlets and articles. They put him into two big books. He made stump speeches all over France, anybody who would listen. And he created a free trade movement in France that spread to other countries in Europe. Also, he was in contact with Cobden and Bright, and then he died shortly after that. But it's a really inspiring story of how one man, or two or three men, really changed the world in Europe over this. And so that's why Bastiat is up here somewhere. I don't know if he's up in this room. He's right over my head. There he is. He probably ought to be. Okay. And so what I thought I'd move on to is an illustration of the effects of protectionism with the American experience in the 19th century. And then I'll end, and we'll have time for questions or discussion. Because as I said, you had George Washington, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson being strong advocates of free trade. I think at the U.S. Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C., right over the front in the cement building there is a slogan from Jefferson about free trade encouraging peace with all nations. I forget exactly what it says. I used to have it memorized. I haven't been there a long time. And it's kind of a farce now because the Commerce Department is what orchestrates protectionism. And they have this free trade slogan over the front of their building, a very Orwellian building, like D.C. in general is. But we had this revolt, and it was the British Navigation Acts restricted the ability of the colonists to engage in trade with Europe by essentially forcing them to use British ships, British sailors, and sort of to pay a tribute, in effect, to the British government and the British navigation industry if they were going to trade. And this really angered them. They thought this was just plunder, and the colonists in general thought, well, if they can do this to us, where will the end be? Or will there ever be an end if they can just nickel and dime us in these ways with this law, that law, the stamp tax, tea tax? They saw it as endless, and so that's one of the reasons they revolted. And so the revolution is over, and we had the Constitution allowed for free trade within the states because the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution outlawed tariffs between the states. And so free trade within the states, and if you think of it, it would be similar to free trade within Europe. If you look at Europe as a number of states like the American states, if you had free trade there, that would be what they had. But where protectionism started to come in, the U.S. government financed itself primarily with the tariff and a few excise taxes. That was what was in the U.S. Constitution. There was no income tax in this country until 1913. There was one during the Civil War.
What's an excise tax?
It's a tax on like gasoline, a tax on gasoline, a tax on beer. It's usually you can have a fixed tax like 10 cents per bottle of beer, or a percentage. You can have a 20% tax called ad valorem. So you can have a 20% tax in percentage terms instead of a dollar terms on a product. Every state has excise taxes on gasoline, for example. When I rent a car when I come down here, and I always, if I have to fill up before I go to the Atlanta airport, I make sure I get into Georgia before I fill up because the gas is usually about 20 cents a gallon cheaper. But just because there's a lower excise tax on gas in Georgia than there is in Alabama, and so it makes kind of a difference. And there's a federal excise tax on gas too, If you buy a bottle of whiskey and you pay $10, you're probably paying $7 or more in excise tax out of that bottle of $10 bottle of liquor. It's easy for government to come up with rationales for taxing things that are bad for us, like cigarettes and liquor. So they do it. The origins of protectionism were the government was supposed to be financed primarily through tariffs, which it was for a long time, and they call this a revenue tariff, a tariff rate of about 10 to 15%. The founders thought would be sufficient to finance the constitutional functions of government, but not high enough to deter trade. Wouldn't make that much of a difference in blocking imports. If a woolen blanket comes in from England and they put a 10% tax on it, they thought that, well, that tax money would be collected at the port and it would be used to finance the government, but it wouldn't have that much of a significant effect on trade competition between British and American woolen blanket manufacturers and sellers. But then when Jefferson was president, probably the dumbest thing he did was, although he probably didn't have any choice, I guess, we didn't have much of a navy, and the British were confiscating American ships and sailors. And so Jefferson reacted by putting an embargo on trade. And of course, they never worked completely. People just go anyway. They smuggle and go anyway. But as a result from that, it did harm the New England shipping industry very severely. And to compensate the New England shipping industry, they passed a tariff in 1816, not just the shipping industry, but New England business in general. The things that are being shipped from New England were being harmed too. So to help New England, to compensate them from this act, they passed a moderate tariff that was construed as possibly protectionist as opposed to just a revenue tariff. But then there was a group of men, Hamilton was dead by then, but his political heir was Henry Clay. And Henry Clay was a big protectionist. He was in the pocket of business, always was. The Whig Party was always the party of the business elite in America. And that was, he created something called his policy combination of the Whig Party. He called it the American system, and plank number one was protectionist tariffs. The implication being, if you're not for protectionist tariffs, you're anti-American, unpatriotic, traitor, which is very Orwellian because, as I said earlier, the founders were free traders. That was the real American idea. And so here's Henry Clay coming along saying the American idea is the opposite of that. It wasn't. It was Henry Clay's idea. Yeah, so
the founders were, except for Hamilton, were free traders. Why did they codify tariffs?
What did they what?
Why did they include tariffs?
Well, they thought a revenue tariff was acceptable because tariffs have to be at a certain level before they have an actual effect on trade. So they thought a tariff that would be low would be sufficient to pay the functions of government, so that they didn't know. Direct taxes were not in the Constitution. This is an indirect tax there. So that's what I think.
What do you mean by revenue tax? The tariffs taxes were taxes on products
coming in.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the barrier to free trade. So if they're free trade, it's fine.
It's all a matter of degree. If it's a 1% tariff, it's not going to be much of a barrier to trade. That was their thinking. You asked me what their thinking was. That's what their thinking was. A low tariff will not be a barrier to trade, is what their thinking was. I'm not saying it's ironclad logic. That's what the idea was. But it makes sense. It's certainly a 10% tariff is not as onerous as a 50% tariff on things, and so they did not want an income tax. They did not want to tax wages or income. Jefferson thought it was a mistake that they even included excise taxes to tax whiskey and things like that, because after the Whiskey Rebellion, he said it was a mistake to include that in the Constitution. We should have just had tariffs and nothing else. And so that's what they did. And so they raised the tariff rate, but then this cabal of protectionists led by Henry Clay succeeded in 1824 of putting in a tariff that was pretty significant. It was more like about a 30% tariff. And this immediately created a division in America between North and South, because what manufacturing there was, textile mills and textile producers and things, was mostly in New England and the North, and the South was an agrarian society. They manufactured very little. Southerners bought their farm tools, shoes, clothing, primarily from either northern manufacturers of these things or Europe. And they concentrated on farming. But most of the things that were included on the tariff lists were things that Southerners bought, all the manufactured goods. And they didn't see any benefit to them. There were a few things, there were a few farm items that were covered by tariffs. So there were some Southern politicians who were for this higher tariff, but very few. And so it immediately created a sense of plunder that this group of Northerners who had gained enough control of the Congress to have this law passed were using the government to plunder us. It was what the South was saying in 1824. And they thought that was an illegitimate function of government, to just rob one section for the benefit of another section. And you see this in the breakdown of the vote on this 1824 tariff. There were 107 House of Representatives votes in favor of the tariff. Only 3 came from southern states. 3 out of 107 votes, because they obviously saw that this was just a power grab on the part of the Whig Party, which represented the northern business interests, to simply plunder southern taxpayers. In the United States Senate, there were 25 yes votes for this tariff. Only 2 came from southern states. So as early as 1824, there was a big division between North and South. And then encouraged by this, Henry Clay sponsored another tariff increase 4 years later in 1828, and it increased the average tariff rate to about 50%. 50%. Now these were averages. The 1824 tariff had a 200% tariff or tax on woolen blankets. So a southern household that wanted to buy a woolen blanket for the wintertime had a 200% tax tacked on it, and you could see why they would be against this. And so in this 50% tariff in 1828 was referred to as the tariff of abominations by Southerners, the tariff of abominations. And South Carolina led the opposition to that, and they denounced it as this, a usurpation, a system of robbery and plunder which made one section tributary to another, only so that corrupt politicians of the North could buy up partisans and retain power. This is one Southern politician from South Carolina, and I think that's a perfectly accurate description of what was going on here. This is Bastiat's legal plunder. This is exactly what it was. It just turned out that it has sort of a regional division of all this. And so South Carolina eventually adopted an ordinance of nullification. And last night in my talk I mentioned the Jefferson's Kentucky Resolve of 1798, where he just announced that we don't agree with unlimited submission to the central government, and we reserve the right to nullify a law that we think is unconstitutional. And they did this. South Carolinians did this, and they issued a law that, in 1833 that said that this tariff is null, void, no law, nor binding upon this state, its officers, or citizens. And it's interesting to see they were serious about this, so they're not going to enforce this law. And I'll read you some of the stipulations of this law. It authorized importers to recover any goods that had been impounded by federal tariff collectors. Sheriffs were instructed to seize the personal property of the tariff collectors. So the tax collector shows up, they could take the shirt off his back, literally, and kick him out of town, and award it to the importers, give it all to the importers until their seized goods were returned. All duties were to be reimbursed to the importers with interest. So if they did collect tax, they have to give it back to the importer and with interest. Tariff collectors were subject to fines and imprisonment for any attempts to resist the nullification law. So if the tax collector resisted, they put him in jail. No jail in the state could be used to imprison anyone for failure to pay the tariff. And a fund of $200,000 was made available to the governor of the state to purchase firearms if necessary to enforce it. So they were pretty serious in 1828 about not collecting this tariff, which they just saw an instrument of plunder.
Where was the $200,000 coming from?
Well, the states raised taxes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. Well, state government. They had their state government. Well, why?
Well, I mean, you know, it sounds like we're trading one tax at big government for another, but...
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I suppose. That libertarians always make that argument, the Simon Pure argument about these things. They do it with the Civil War too. And when, for example, in the Civil War in 1862, the largest army ever assembled in the history of the world was 2 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. Okay, 2 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. The biggest arsenal ever assembled, easily big enough to incinerate the city of Richmond in a day, if they could get close enough to do it, and kill everybody there, which was their aim. Okay, your typical libertarian will say, well, rather than raising taxes to raise an army to ward off this impending demolition of Richmond, Jefferson Davis should have stood up on his soapbox and quoted John Locke and the Rights of Man. You know, he'd be a pure libertarian idealist. And, you know, but when you're in a situation like that and your existence is threatened, what do you expect people to do? And so I always get a kick out of libertarians who object to this sort of thing because they're pure. The perfect can be the enemy of the good in cases like this. And so this is how they chose to ward off what they saw as a destruction of the Constitution and endless plunder of them economically. So it's not just a silly matter, one tax over the other. I mean, I think they had a good reason for it. Okay, and so you can be a purist, but if Jefferson Davis was a purist, he would have been killed in 1862, and all the innocent people of Richmond would have too. Most of them. But, why was the South so agitated about this in particular? It wasn't just that they were not manufacturers and the manufacturers were primary beneficiaries. That it was an agricultural society and an export-dependent society. And at the time, they were exporting 50 to 75% of everything they produced, selling it in Europe. And what this means is, as I said earlier, exporters are always disproportionately harmed. And they're disproportionately harmed in a number of ways. One is they have to pay more for all the things they buy, farm tools, clothing, and so forth. They pay more for that. And then when they anybody will naturally try to pass on the cost of that by charging more for what they sell. But they found they couldn't do that because the markets in Europe were intensely competitive and they couldn't raise their prices. If they raised their prices, they would lose market share. And so they couldn't do that. That was one thing. Then they also realized that since this sort of thing restricted trade, fewer dollars were going to Europe because Americans were buying fewer things from Europe. And the Europeans, who were their biggest customers, did not have as much money as they used to have to buy their farm goods. So they were hurt twice. They had to pay more for the things they bought, and they sold less of the things they sold because the export markets were drying up. And they sold when the Civil War broke out, there was fully 75% of all southern produce was sold in Europe. And so this was a big issue to them. There was a textbook by Wilson Brown and Jan Hogendorn called International Economics, where they said the only group that is powerless to pass the cost of tariffs on further are the exporters, who have to sell at world prices and swallow these costs. In essence, a tax on imports becomes a tax on exports as well. And they recognize this. The people of the South recognize this. Calhoun himself, he wrote a letter about this to a colleague, a political associate of his in Watertown, New York, at the time, and he said this: a protectionist tariff gives to one section, the North, the power of recharging the duty because they resold in the North because they paid higher prices too, consumers in the North, while to the other, the South, is a pure unmitigated burden. And so they recognized this. They saw their pocketbooks drying up as a result of this. And it wasn't only the South in the antebellum era. There's an excellent book called The Income Tax by Frank Chodoroff that he talks about Midwestern farmers in the late 19th century who were being mugged by tariffs. And he says this: the plight of these Midwestern farmers was made worse by the protective tariff policy of the government. the best they could get for their products was the competitive world price, while manufacturers they bought from the East, meaning New England for the most part, were loaded down with duties. The populace clamored for lower tariffs. So he was examining the move for an income tax. And the Midwest farmers of the 1880s were in the same boat as the Southern farmers were in the 1820s, 1850s, and that they were being plundered by these tariffs because their export markets were drying up. I'm going to hand out here, I have a table that shows, I'll just pass this around here, shows the average tariff rate in the U.S. from 1810 to 1870. And I'll put some on this side too that you could look at. Because what happened next is there was a period of free trade in America, relative free trade, where after this tariff of abominations, there was a confrontation with Andrew Jackson, who wanted to enforce the tariff, but the South Carolinians nullified it, and so they compromised. There was a compromise tariff at a lower rate. Henry Clay was steamed, very angry over this, and he promised he would fight the devil to get the tariff raised again, and all that kind of language. But he lost that battle by the 1830s, and so from the 1830s to about 1857, the average tariff rate went down, and you can see it on this handout here. It hit the high point, the average tariff rate. You see the tariff of abominations there, way above 60% by 1830. Then by 1833, they reached a compromise. That's when the compromise was finally reached. Then the trend was all down until around the Civil War, the time of the Civil War. And then, but before Abraham Lincoln was nominated even, the House of Representatives passed the Morrill Tariff, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, named after a Vermont steel manufacturer and congressman named Justin Morrill. And that passed in the 1859-1860 session of Congress at the House of Representatives. And so the Republican Party was in existence by then, and there was a deep recession in 1857, and the Republicans said, well, the obvious solution to the recession is protectionism, high tariffs. And they succeeded, in the House anyway, in the House of Representatives anyway. And the vote there was extremely lopsided, just like it was in 1824. There was, of the states that would eventually secede in the Civil War, there was only one vote, yes vote, for the Morrill Tariff in the House of Representatives. It was from a congressman from Tennessee who probably, in his district, probably had some jute farmers or something like that, and the jute must have been covered by the tariffs. But there was one vote from the South for the Morrill Tariff in the House of Representatives. And then when Lincoln came in, President Buchanan had just signed the bill. The Senate passed it. The Southern Democrats were gone. So this was started before the Civil War. It was not a war financing tariff. It was a protectionist tariff meant to be a protectionist tariff, not war financing. But it was used, the revenue, of course, was used for the war. And so the tariff was raised to 33%, roughly 33%, and then to 48% by the Lincoln administration. And it stayed, so that's where you see the big jump up. And it stops here in about 1868 or something like that. But the rest of the story is the tariff rate remained about that level until 1913. Until 1913. It remained in the 40 to 50% range, the average tariff. It remained there. And then we had the income tax. And at that time, there was a bait and switch routine that went on. The argument for the income tax was we will reduce the tariff rate. They were saying this to members of Congress from farm states and free trade areas on the coast, for example, if you vote for the income tax. And so they did. They reduced the tariff rate in 1913. Woodrow Wilson did that, and we got the income tax. But then by 1922, there was the Fordney-McCumber tariff that increased the average tariff rate back up to around 32%. And then after that, there was 1930 came along, and we had the Smoot-Hawley Hoover tariff. which increased the average tariff rate once again to 59.1%. 59, back up to the 60% that it was in 1828. And so it was a bait and switch. We'll cut the tariff rate if you give us the income tax. They got the income tax, and they shot the tariff rate back up afterwards because they could. So, and the Smoot-Hawley Hoover tariff was quite a disaster. Many imported goods were cut off altogether because the tariff rate was so high. If the tariff rate is 10 or 20%, a lot of importers, for example, they can just cut their prices. They can still compete. They'll have to cut their prices, which means they cut their profit margin, but they'll still compete. But if the tariff is 200%, there's not enough to cut. They can't compete, so they just won't even bother shipping anything here. So there were quite a few goods that just dried up altogether, just didn't come here. And there was massive retaliation from throughout the world, where countries all over the world imposed very high tariffs on American goods coming into their countries. And so that was another thing that happened immediately. Exports, American exports, were 53% lower in 1932 compared to 1929. And so they were cut in half exports because of this phenomenon of our trading partners being impoverished, therefore they can't buy as much from us. That was one of the main reasons for that. And of course it also strengthened the political hand of the Japanese fascists also. So the Smoot-Hawley Hoover tariff sort of ignited the Great Depression. In fact, I was just on a dissertation committee at George Mason University from a student of mine. He was an undergraduate student of mine in the mid-'80s, 20 years ago. And he graduated, worked in the family business in a grocery store, and then came back to school and got to get his PhD. And you have a 7-year window to get a PhD at George Mason, and he had 10 days left to get his PhD. He kind of goofed off, I guess, a lot for 7 years. But his dissertation advisor pressured him, and he finished. He got his degree. But his degree was on his dissertation was on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, and he's an Austrian. From an Austrian perspective, his name's Tom Rustisi, and he wrote this. It's actually the PhD in public policy at George Mason. It wasn't economics per se, but it was an economics dissertation. And the one new wrinkle he put in this that I think is significant is he connected the banking crisis in America at the beginning of the Great Depression to the tariff. And how he did that was connecting it to the export effect. That we had this huge tariff, Smoot-Hawley did 60% on average, that dried up exports, especially agricultural exports. That devastated the farm areas of the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and the South, and the banks in those areas were the first to go belly up during the Great Depression. It was the banks in the farm areas especially. And so that was the link between the Smoot-Hawley Tariff and the Great Depression. And that has been largely overlooked. There's a lot of stuff that's been written about the banking crisis and everything. And a lot of economists have also written that, well, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, less than 10% of the economy was international trade. So even if it was an onerous tariff, it couldn't have caused the whole economy to tank like that. But he did a very nice job of relating the tariff to the drying up of exports, to a depression, immediate depression in the farm sector, which caused all the banks to go bankrupt. And that was the beginning of the banking crisis in the Great Depression. So that was quite the debacle.
Yeah, just because I think Minsky's famous supply side argument, look, the way the world works makes that point. That's like a big claim to fame, I guess.
Yeah.
Supply side movement. He actually blames the depression on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff.
Yeah, he does it in a different way, I'm sure, but most people, even most economists, you look it up in the textbooks, and they'll say that since trade was less than 10% of GDP, even if you had a big tariff like that, it shouldn't cause the whole economy. It should cause a small part of the economy. But that Winniski is one of the few to look into a little more deeply, and this Tom Rustisi did too. That's all I wanted to say about this for now. I'll take any questions. You had a question.
Well,
brilliant commentary too. If you have brilliant commentary, go ahead.
I was going to make a comment that the so-called Dust Bowl in Oklahoma took place about that time.
Yeah.
Really good for the farmer. I don't know what took him more
was the lack of exports or lack of arable land during that period of
Yeah.
time. But my mother grew in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
She talks about how like there was no rain.
The Dust
I think
Bowl,
it was
yeah.
over 2 years.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There was, I think there's an economist named Terry Anderson. Actually, has made the argument that the Homestead Act of the 1860s sort of artificially limited a lot of plots of land to 160 acres, and led to overly intensive farming, which made the Dust Bowl much worse than it otherwise would have been had it just been sort of a free market purchase of land, and people would have been able to have more than 100. Well, it was arbitrary, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. So,
What's the current tariff rate?
if you look, the current tariff rate I think is under 4% on average. So today, the average tariff rate, it differs widely. Bush put 50% tariffs on steel, but then now they're rescinding them, they're reducing them. But I think on average, but that's a tricky number because there are so many things that tariffs apply to, and that it's not all even. There might be a 60, 70, 80% rate on some things, but then on zero on many other things. So it's kind of a tricky statistic, but the statistic the government uses when it publishes the average tariff rate is like 3.8% or something like that. That's what I mentioned at the beginning. Attempts at protectionism nowadays are often non-tariff trade barriers, like dumping cases. Accuse the foreign company of charging a price that is too low, and of course that's an awful thing. We don't want low prices. We can't have that under any circumstances. So I think you had your hand up next, and the guy in the back.
What's the Austrian take on GATT?
GATT, the General Agreement to Talk and Talk. Is that what you're related to? Well, what GATT was a response to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which led to this disaster. And so the countries of the world who realized that they had made a big mistake by following Herbert Hoover in his protectionist binge, spent the next 50 years whittling away at tariff rates. That's what GATT basically did for a long, long time. So if you look at the creation of GATT, that's one of the things they attempted to do, is whittle away, and it did produce this bilateral negotiations among all the countries to reduce tariffs. But they would meet every couple of years and talk for years, and then come to an agreement. The end result of the whole mess, though, was that, we have a 3.5% to 4% average tariff rate here, and a lot of other countries do. They did reduce tariff rates, but it's a big international bureaucracies can also do a lot of mischief too. So there are all kinds of regulations and controls that the GATT negotiators agreed to that hindered trade. That's why there's no Austrian position. I mean, if there was an Austrian position on GATT and everything like that, it would be published somewhere. You could go on the internet and type in Austrian position on GATT. But Austrian Economics is a way of thinking about things, and you could come up with whatever your position is based on Austrian Economics. But it's sort of like I was against NAFTA. I wrote newspaper articles with titles like "Support Free Trade, Reject NAFTA," the North American Free Trade Agreement, because it sounded nice, free trade agreement. What's wrong with that? But if you read it, it was several thousand pages of fine print written by Bill Clinton's lawyer, putting all sorts of regulation and restrictions on trade. That's not free trade. That's government-managed trade. And there were all sorts of things like forcing Mexico to ratchet up its environmental and labor regulation, which would make it more costly for them to produce things, which was sort of underhanded or backdoor protectionism, because the AFL-CIO wanted that, not because they were concerned about the quality of the air in Mexico City. They were concerned about too many imports coming in from Mexico competing with union jobs in America. So you had all that kind of stuff, and even though it's called a free trade agreement, it wasn't free trade, and GATT had a lot of that similar type of thing. If you look at just that one thing, the tariff rate, it did go down worldwide in the 50 years after World War II, but there was a lot of other mischief that was created by the same. If you want free trade, all you need is agreement that says no more tariffs. It's like my old friend Yuri Maltsev, who is a Russian immigrant. He actually was a defector from the Soviet Union. He was an advisor to Gorbachev for a while. When they were all talking about these 5-year plans to get the former Soviet Union into the capitalist world, Yuri had his one-day plan. Because all these economists from Harvard had 5-year, 10-year, and Yuri just had one day, the Maltsev one-day plan. No price controls, free market, and that's it. But everybody else had, well, we need a new bureaucracy, we need a new trade bureaucracy for Russia, we need a new antitrust laws, we need all this and all that. And the same is true with the free trade. I think yes, sir. You had your hand up.
Back to Jefferson. Jefferson was a huge fan of Turgot and Adam Smith. If you go to his plantation mine shelter in Virginia, you can see in the museum there how he utilized division of labor.
Oh yeah.
In his farming practice.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he was a fan of Turgot. It's kind of striking, a lot of people, and all the work I've done on the Civil War era, I read the other authors, historians who make these comments that, well, the work of Adam Smith really hadn't made it to America yet, these ideas about free trade, and so you can't fault the Republicans for being such protectionists. They didn't have, but Jefferson knew about it, so why didn't the politicians of 1860 or 1850 know about it? They knew about it. Yeah. Oh, sure. There was Bastiat's first American translator was a 18-year-old woman from South Carolina named Louisa McCord. And I read about her. I read her. There's a book about her, and I read her essays. She was a brilliant, like a genius of a woman, a phenomenon. 17, 18 years old, translating Boston, and she understood all the economics too of it. And she helped spread the free trade doctrine in first South Carolina and then elsewhere. But she was from Columbia, South Carolina, and so this was well known, free trade. In my book on Lincoln, I quote some northern newspapers in New Jersey, New York, and elsewhere saying, it's been known for a long time that the South has adopted the free trade doctrine of Adam Smith, and that's the source of all these troubles, referring to the Civil War, the tariff dispute at the beginning of the American Civil War. So it was well known by then. I guess we're about out of time.